What is consciousness? If you search on YouTube, what is consciousness, you're going to find a lot of videos where different people talk about consciousness and seek to define it. It can be scientists on one hand, it can be philosophers, it can be spiritual gurus or teachers, because it's a topic, of course, that has been kicked around for a very long time. So if you watch a selection of these videos, you can quickly become confused. I became confused when I did so, and I've actually read about consciousness for many years. But as I was contemplating this topic, there was one thought that came to me, and it is this. Consciousness is that which allows us to study objects, but which in itself cannot be made an object of study. Now just let that sink in a little bit. Consciousness allows us to study objects, but we can't make consciousness an object of study. And of course, any scientist is going to object to this and say, everything can be made an object of study. That's the whole purpose of science. Philosophers might say everything can become an object of philosophy. Well, but just try and step back a little bit. What allows you to ask the question, what is consciousness? It's that you're conscious. I recently read about a neuroscientist who had been studying and researching neuroscience for 40 years and who said there's a growing number of neuroscientists who are beginning to realize that we are studying consciousness based on the brain, but the very fact that we can study consciousness is that we're conscious. If you were not conscious, you couldn't even ask the question, what is consciousness? And what you see most scientists do is they will try to study the contents of consciousness. What is going on in the brain, what is going on in the mind. Philosophers, psychologists, they study what we can call the contents of consciousness. But what if there's a difference between the contents of consciousness and consciousness itself? In other words, because we are conscious, we can have all these topics in our minds that we are interested in. We can direct our attention to different things. We can study, as I said, we can study objects. And it's because we are consciously looking out at these objects. But when we reverse the direction of our attention and look in, can we actually see consciousness? Can we discover consciousness as an object? I know this might seem very subtle, but just think about it this way. This is a camera. I'm recording this on another camera, a video camera, and I can use this camera to take a picture of the video camera. And I can use the video camera, obviously, to take a picture of this camera. But could I use this camera to take a picture of itself? Well, obviously I can't. Well, maybe I can, because here's a magical device called a mirror. And if I go like this, it seems like the camera is taking a picture of itself. But is it? Not really. The camera is taking a picture of its mirror image. But that's not the same thing. So really, the question is, can we ever define what consciousness is? If we look in, if we look into our own consciousness, what do we discover? Well, this is what mystics have been doing for thousands of years. All of recorded history that we know, there have been mystics who have been looking in. And when you look into your mind, the first thing you see is all of the contents of consciousness. The feelings, the thoughts, your sense of identity, all of these contents, but that isn't consciousness. They are just objects in consciousness. And they exist in your consciousness because you're conscious. So we could say, in a sense, that your consciousness is a container. Your mind is a container, and in that container are objects. You may have different objects than I do, but they are objects in consciousness. Okay, so what mystics have done for thousands of years is they have gone deeply into their own minds, and they have gone beyond the objects, beyond the contents, beyond the thoughts. And any of us has the ability to do this. Many, many people over the past 30, 40 years have done so through meditation, contemplation. And what happens is that you can go into a state of mind where you are conscious, you are experiencing that you are conscious. But there's no objects in consciousness. In other words, your thoughts, your feelings, your sense of identity, they've all faded away. You are just conscious. And you're clearly aware that you're conscious. But there's no, other than that, there's no experience in consciousness other than awareness. We can call it pure awareness, non-differentiated awareness, non-local awareness. And when you have had this experience, you realize that there's more to consciousness than the contents, the objects. Now, if you haven't had that experience, then you can still believe that just as there are objects in consciousness, consciousness itself can be made an object. But once you have had the experience of pure awareness, you realize that you cannot make this an object of study. And it's just like the camera cannot take a picture of itself. You are conscious. Yes. But you cannot step outside of your own consciousness and look at your own consciousness, just like the camera cannot step outside itself and take a picture of itself. You are conscious, yes. But there comes a point where you have gone beyond all the objects of consciousness. And now you're experiencing pure awareness, and that pure awareness you can't step out of. You can't look at it as an object that you're studying, because when you're studying an object, if you're an astronomer studying the moon, you are clearly in your mind seeing that you are here and the moon is outside yourself, and you're studying it from a distance. Now, if you haven't had this experience of pure awareness, you can think, well, there just comes a point where this is consciousness and I can study that. But you see, when you've had the experience, you realize, no. When you get to that level of pure awareness, you cannot step outside of it. There's no way to look at it from a distance. So if you try to define what consciousness is from a distance, you're not defining something that's there. You are creating a fantasy, a mental image in your mind. Why is that important? Well, it's important for a number of reasons, but let's just take one. What has been the quest of scientists for now, 500 years or more? It's been objectivity. This has been the holy grail of science, objectivity. But you see, what are scientists actually doing? Are scientists discovering something that is there, or are they defining in their minds what they think should be there? This is, in a sense, at the heart of the human experience. Are we discovering a real world that exists independently of our minds? Or is it so that everything we discover in our minds is just created in our minds? In other words, is objectivity possible? The holy grail of science for 500 years has been objectivity. But is it possible to be objective, truly objective? I'm not saying it isn't. I'm just raising the question. So how do we approach this? Well, let me use an example here. This book is called The Astonishing Hypothesis, The Scientific Search for the Soul, written by Francis Crick. He is a famous scientist, received a Nobel Prize for co-discovering DNA. He's also all his life been a materialist and wanting to explain everything, including now the soul and consciousness, based on the physical processes in the brain. So here's from the introduction of his book. The astonishing hypothesis is that you, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will, is in fact no more than the behavior of the vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. As Lewis Carroll's Alice might have phrased it, you are nothing but a pack of neurons. So, if this is correct, and this is the basic claim of all materialists, that consciousness can be explained based on the brain, the function of the brain, then the dream of objectivity is gone. In fact, science is gone. In fact, truth is gone, completely gone. And this obviously isn't what Francis Crick has in mind, because you could say that if Francis Crick really believed what he said here, you're nothing but a pack of neurons, why write the other 300 pages where he's trying to convince you, the reader, that his hypothesis is correct? I know this is tricky to understand, but just think about it. What Francis Crick is hypothesizing here, which he thinks he has proven, he's assured that he's right, is that my belief, my way of looking at life, it's just a product of how the neurons in my brain are firing. Now, if he really believed in this, he wouldn't have written the whole book, because he would have realized that it was pointless to try and convince me of something I don't believe in right now. Because my view of life, let's say I'm obviously a spiritual person, so my spiritual outlook on life, according to Francis Crick, this is just a product, it's not a truth, it's just a product of how my neurons are firing. Right? And so he is saying that if I read this 300-page book here, I'm going to be convinced that my worldview, my spiritual worldview is wrong. And I'm going to agree with him that it's wrong. But how could that happen if my spiritual view is just a matter of how my neurons are firing? How could I change my mind? At the conscious level, I can read his book, But what materialism is saying is that I, at the conscious level, I have no conscious control over my neurons. I can't change how my neurons are firing. So what could possibly change my view of life? The other thing that makes his claim self-contradictory is that he obviously believes he is an exception to what he's saying. Because if you take the consequence of what he's saying, you are nothing but a bunch of neurons, I am nothing but a bunch of neurons, then he is also nothing but a pack of neurons. And his materialistic view of life is just a result of how his neurons are firing. This means everything that we human beings believe or don't believe is just a matter of how our neurons are firing. There's no truth. There's no reality. It's meaningless to talk about some higher truth. It's meaningless to say that science has a higher truth than religion. It's just a matter of how the neurons are firing. There's no objective reality here. Everything we experience is produced by our brains. And our brains are individual, and they are firing in individual ways. That's why we have different beliefs. There is no objectivity, and there never could be. So you see, by the very fact that he believes he has discovered some kind of truth, and that he can convince me to agree with him, he's actually showing that he doesn't believe we are just packs of neurons. He still believes in this claim of science that it's possible to attain objectivity. I also believe in that. I totally agree with that. But the question is, how could we possibly attain objectivity? And this has to start with a recognition. There's more to consciousness than the physical brain. Why is that necessary? Because look at what Francis Crick is saying. Everything that happens in your mind is just a result of your neurons firing a certain way. Give you an analogy. There's a movie playing on a movie screen. There are people in that movie that seem to be conscious. They are talking, they're having a discussion. They might even be having a philosophical discussion. But what is projected on the movie screen is just a result of whatever is in the film strip in the movie projector. There's nothing at the level of the movie screen that can change what is on the film strip in the projector. Nothing whatsoever. And what Francis Crick is saying is that your brain is the movie projector and the film strip. And your conscious awareness is just the movie playing on the screen. And there is, even though you think you're conscious, even though you think you can make decisions, even though you think you can agree or disagree with what I'm saying, your reaction to what I'm saying is not you making a decision. This is just how your neurons are firing. And your neurons may be able to adapt to what I'm saying and react to what I'm saying. But there's no you making a decision whether to agree with me or not. It's just your neurons firing. That means you may think that the way your neurons are firing is revealing some objective truth. But according to Francis Crick, no, that can't be the case. Your brain is just a product of random evolutionary process, and it has resulted in you having the brain function you have, and I have the brain function I have. There's no objective reality here determining what you believe and what I believe. There's no truth according to this, which means, as I said, science is meaningless. If you're a strict materialist, science is meaningless. Why don't you just lay down and die? And so we have to start recognizing there is part of consciousness, there's something in consciousness that is beyond the brain. It can't be, consciousness cannot be an epiphenomenon of the brain. Or science, philosophy is meaningless. Life is meaningless. Okay, so if we now look beyond the brain, right, and there are many scientists who are beginning to do this. Donald Hoffman, for example, has said that after 40 years of intense new scientific research, we don't know how you observe the color red. We don't even have a credible theory of how the brain produces the sensation of the color red. Therefore, he's saying we have to look elsewhere, and with elsewhere he means look beyond the brain. So now let's look at consciousness then. And as I said, when you start looking in, the first thing you observe in your own mind is all of these, the contents. Your feelings, your thoughts, your sense of identity, what you believe in, what you don't believe in. You might have arguments for this or that. And you could say all of these contents of consciousness, they are forming a perception filter. So, Francis Crick, when he was alive, the contents of his consciousness formed a perception filter that made him a materialist. The contents of my consciousness form a perception filter that make me a spiritual person. I have a spiritual outlook on life, he had a materialistic outlook on life. But these are the contents of consciousness. So, if we look beyond this, is there still consciousness? And as I said, millions of people through various meditative practices, mindfulness, all kinds of practices have experienced pure awareness. Millions of people have actually experienced it without doing anything to have the experience. It just happens spontaneously. And it's just that science hasn't in general really recognized this. And part of the reason for this was, and I understand this, I agree with it to a large degree, we'll go back to the Middle Ages where you had the Catholic Church, which is the biggest mind control machine in human history, which stated that the Earth is the center of the universe. Then Galileo and others started looking at the movements of the objects in the sky and said, it doesn't seem like they're moving around the Earth. It seems like they're moving around something else. And then they were immediately burned at the stake or put under house arrest or denounced as heretics and this and that. So obviously, the Catholic Church was a completely insane institution that was not objective at all. It was a highly subjective because it wanted to maintain the view that Catholic doctrine was infallible. I totally understand this had to go for society to move forward. I am in complete agreement with this. I'm not, contrary to many people who seem to try to question materialism, I'm not trying to defend a particular religion here. But what happened with science was that in the beginning, scientists were just observing. They were just making observations. And this was this desire to be objective. So they are saying, let's look at things that clearly were not created in our minds. Like the moon, there's something up there. And it's moving around the Earth and we can study it. And if one person studies it on this side of the Earth and another studies it on another side of the Earth, they reach the same conclusion, the same observation. It doesn't matter what I believe or what the other person believes. If we are looking at the moon and making accurate observations, it's the same observation. So I totally understand that scientists wanted to distance themselves from the subjectivity of religion. But what unfortunately happened to science was that there were some scientists that we might say they didn't really understand what objectivity means. So they decided that objectivity can only be attained when we eliminate any influence by the mind. Because the mind, they defined, can only be subjective. And so they came up with this idea that all religion is just superstition created by the mind. And science should be used to prove the fallacy of religion. And therefore they come up with this materialistic paradigm. We could call it the materialistic gospel or the materialistic doctrines, that there is nothing outside the material universe, there's nothing outside of what we can measure with physical instruments. And this has ruled science even to this day, and it's only within the last few decades that more and more scientists have begun to realize that this is actually limiting science. It's truly limiting science. And let me just very briefly show you why it's limiting science. Because one of the principles of science is that in order to know whether your observations are accurate, you need to understand the instrument you are using to make those observations. And you may say that a scientist is using a telescope to observe the moon. Or he is using an infinitely more complex technology called a particle accelerator to study the smallest physical particles. And you may say that, well, the telescope always works the same for all observers, the particle accelerator works the same for all observers. And I agree with that. The problem is that the scientist isn't just using a telescope to observe the moon. He's also using his mind or her mind. So the fundamental scientific instrument that we are using is the mind. And what scientists decided in various stages, first back when they decided to focus on measurable things, but also psychology that wanted to study psychology in a way that could be measured, they decided to exclude the human mind and to exclude the study of the human mind from science. Consciousness isn't relevant to science. But how can you know if you are making accurate observations if you don't want to study the most fundamental technology instrument you are using to make those studies, namely the mind? And that's why I'm saying if you start looking at the mind, you are realizing there are contents of the human mind that form a perception filter that colors the way we look at everything. So, I earlier said if you take Francis Crick's hypothesis, then his materialistic view of life is not a higher truth, it's just a product of how his neurons are firing. But I would step back from that and say when we go beyond the brain, we realize that Francis Crick's materialistic outlook on life is a product of the contents in the container of his mind, his subconscious mind. In other words, in his subconscious mind, he has certain structures that we can say they're like colored glasses. When he's looking through those colored glasses, he sees only what the glasses allow to go through. So in other words, when he's taking on his materialistic glasses, he sees only evidence that validates the materialistic outlook on life, and any evidence to the contrary, he filters out. It's not true, it's not relevant, and so forth. The same thing with a Christian who believes that the Bible is the Word of God, the infallible Word of God. He has a perception filter that blocks out as invalid any evidence to the contrary, any evidence produced by science. Me as a spiritual person, I have a spiritual perception filter that makes me look at things that validate my spiritual outlook and tend to discard the things that go against it. I truly admit that. But how many people are willing to admit that? How many of us are willing to admit that we have a subconscious perception filter that colors the way we look at everything? There's the old story of Socrates, who said he was the wisest man in Athens because he realized how much he didn't know. Well, I would say the wisest person is the one who realizes that his or her own subconscious mind colors the way we look at everything. And if we realize that, then all of a sudden we can say, what is consciousness? Is it the contents of consciousness? Is it the perception filter? Is that what makes us conscious? Or is consciousness something that is experiencing the world through that subconscious perception filter? And this then reaches back to what I said about objectivity, because we can now ask ourselves a simple question. Would it ever be possible to be truly objective as long as we have a subconscious perception filter that makes us want to see reality a certain way? If you want materialism to be true, could you ever be a truly objective scientist? Scientists claim they are objective, but are they? If you are a materialist, can you really be an objective scientist? Now, I'm not saying this means you have to be a spiritual person. But what this gives rise to is the question, would it be possible for us to get rid of these perception filters, these subconscious contents, so that instead of seeing the world through these colored glasses, we have no glasses and we can just see the world as it is? Or we could say we could see it without imposing a subjective interpretation on it. You see what I'm saying here? A materialist would immediately object to this and say, oh, you're completely wrong. You're right that the religious people, they have a bias. They have a perception filter. They have a subjective view. But we as scientists, we are objective because we are just looking at what can be measured. But you see, is this true? Just observe some of these materialists when they are defending materialism. Do they want materialism to be true? Are they focusing on the arguments for why it's true, the evidence for why it's true? I mean, here's a famous scientist who's written a 300-page book. Everything in this book is evidence for why his hypothesis is true. He does talk about some questions there that science can't answer, but he's sure that it's just a matter of time before materialism will provide the answer. Is that neutral? Is that objective? Is that not a bias? Is it not a bias to say that eventually, someday in the future, when we have built the ultimate particle accelerator or some other ultimate brain study technology, materialism will be able to explain what consciousness is and where it comes from? Is that objective? Is that a neutral observation? And of course, you can go to a fundamentalist Christian, and he will also say, well, materialists are not objective, Muslims are not objective, only we Christians are objective because we have the truly objective source, which is the Bible, which is the Word of God, the literal Word of God. So what I'm just trying to point out here is, you can find all of these groups of people there who all claim they are objective, all the others are subjective. What does it take to just shift a little and say, gosh, everybody's subjective? Because everybody has this subconscious perception filter. And then we can say, okay, would it be possible for us to overcome this subjective perception filter? And the answer is, of course, yes. And scientists themselves have actually demonstrated this. Because scientists, when you go back, they overcame the religious perception filter, which is still very much there. Many people are still reinforcing the Catholic Church is the only true church, Christianity is the only true religion, the Bible is the little word of God. Oh no, it's the Quran, that's the word of God, or the Hindu scriptures, or this or that. So scientists have proven you can overcome some of these perception filters. It's just that many scientists have, instead of the religious perception filter, they've adopted the materialistic perception filter. But wouldn't it be possible to overcome that too? And wouldn't it be possible if we were really willing to look at ourselves, look at our biases, to overcome all perception filters? And I believe many people have proven this, or at least are very close to it. I see people who are starting to question the materialistic paradigm. I see many people who are starting to question the religious paradigms, whether they grew up in this religion or that religion. And what all of these people are doing is reaching for a more neutral way of looking at life. And so my sort of main point for this video is simply to point out, what is consciousness? Well, in its essence, it is that which allows us to study objects. But consciousness can also create a perception filter that colors the way we study objects, the way we study the world. And that means that consciousness can have two features. It can be subjective and objective. And only if we strive to overcome the subconscious perception filters can we approach objectivity. And all of us have been brought up in a context, our family, our society, where we were exposed to these perception filters, collectively created perception filters. I mean, you grew up in America, you're programmed to think that America is the greatest nation on earth. You grow up in Russia, you're programmed to think, no, it's Russia. You grow up in China, you're programmed to think it's China, and so forth and so on. So, and then there's the religious, and then there's the materialistic, and then there's the political, and this and that. So we have all been exposed to these perception filters, and if we are to become truly objective, whether we call ourselves scientists or not, we have to make an effort to look into the subconscious mind. And that's why I'm saying, if you really want to be a scientist, you have to study, you have to know the limitations of the instruments you are using to study the world, and the primary instrument you are using is the mind. If you have never looked into the mind, you're never studying the mind, how can you really know how it's coloring your observations and the way you interpret your observations? Because there is a fundamental difference between observing something and interpreting it. I've used the example before that you can have a circle, you can have a square. And if you're neutral, you're just observing. These are just two different objects, a circle and a square. But the medieval Catholics, they claimed that a circle is the perfect geometrical shape, and therefore the moon must move around the earth in a perfect circle. Now you're imposing a subjective interpretation on circle and square. Now you may have had a certain reaction to watching this video. You may have agreed with me or disagreed with me. But this is your subconscious perception filter that causes this reaction. When you're looking at this camera, do you have an emotional reaction? It's just an object, right? There's no point in, do I like it or not like it? Do I agree with it or not agree with it? So we all have the ability to make these neutral observations, and we all have the propensity to make highly subjective observations. Now, if we go a little bit further and say, okay, so what we really could do, if we want to be scientists or spiritual people or philosophers or just live life, we could make it our goal to strive for neutrality. having a neutral viewpoint and realizing that there are these mechanisms in our subconscious mind that are pulling us into a very subjective viewpoint. But we could, if we then take that process and say, okay, let's say we now have removed most of these perception filters, can we ever be truly objective? And that's why I think we need to have a little bit of humility and say, no, we can't ever be completely objective the way science likes to define objectivity. And the reason for this is that when you look at consciousness, you can go into your own mind, you can go into your subconscious mind, you can see all the contents, the feelings, the thoughts, the sense of identity. You can go beyond that, and you can experience pure awareness. What you experience when you're pure awareness is that you are more than all of the contents of your mind. Your consciousness, there's more to your consciousness than all of the contents of your mind. You can also realize, as even quantum physics is hinting at, that when you experience yourself as pure awareness, you can also experience you are part of a larger whole. Your mind is not an island. Everything is interconnected, as quantum physics says. But nevertheless, as soon as you, again, are looking at the world, you are looking at the world from your individual vantage point. If you and I were sitting across from each other, as I've said several times before, you're looking at me, seeing me from the outside. I'm looking at you, seeing you from the outside. Just as the camera can't take a picture of itself, I can't see myself from the outside, at least not through my senses and the body and the brain. So what I'm saying is, I am an individual consciousness, an individual mind. You are an individual mind. We will always be looking at the world from our individual vantage point. And there is nothing wrong with that. I'm not trying to say in any way there's something wrong with that. I'm not trying to say that we should all come to a point where we all look at the world the same way. But what I am saying is that when we are looking at the world through the outer perception filters that are highly subjective and biased by this belief or that belief, our individual perspectives clash. They clash with each other. They're in competition. We are caught in the right and wrong. But when we attain neutrality, we can still have individual perspectives, but they don't clash. They're not competing. And why is that? Because the deepest state of neutrality we can attain is that we overcome what I, in many of my videos, are called the duality consciousness. And this is the consciousness that makes us think that everything in the world has to be evaluated based on these two polarities, and that there is a value judgment that has to be imposed on the polarities so that one is right, one is wrong, one is good, one is bad, one is truth, one is error. You see what I'm trying to say? The religious bias, clearly subjective, but the materialistic bias is equally subjective, because it's also based on this idea that there has to be an absolute truth that we can define. And what I'm simply trying to say here is that when you overcome at least most of your perception filters and you start having this experience of neutral awareness and you start looking at the world from a neutral vantage point, you are saying, what if there is no ultimate truth, no absolute highest truth? What if consciousness, my consciousness, is a process? An ever-evolving, ever self-transcending process In other words, right now, I'm sitting here. I'm 67 years old. For the past 48 years, I have been systematically studying my own consciousness, trying to become more and more neutral. Yet I have also, as a result of that process, giving up on the idea that I should have reached an ultimate truth, an ultimate understanding. Because I realize I only see what I see based on where I'm at right now in this process. I've gone through a process, I've clearly experienced I've gone through a process of what would you call it, expanding my awareness, raising my awareness. But I also see this is open-ended. I don't know where it's going to end. But I strongly assume that there are higher levels where I can see something I absolutely cannot see today. So why should there be an absolute truth, an absolute understanding? What is it that gives us this quest to define this is the absolute truth and everybody has to believe in it, or they're going to go to hell, or they're not scientists? It's what I call the ego, which is the essential bias that we can have in a subconscious mind. The essential bias is that there is an ultimate truth and I've discovered it, or I can define it. If we really want to be neutral, if we really want to be objective, we have to give this up. We have to give up the idea that there's an ultimate truth and that our minds can either discover it through some process or can define it. And if you're not willing to recognize that, if you're not willing to give up this quest for an ultimate truth, how can you be neutral? How could you ever be neutral? So, you see what I'm saying? Francis Crick, your mind is nothing but a pack of neurons. Objectivity is impossible. But the normal state of most people, where they are totally blinded by their egos, this veil of illusion of these perception filters, yeah, objectivity is also impossible. But if we systematically overcome this ego, this bias, this perception filter, then objectivity is possible. But even if we attain this objectivity, we're still not going to see an absolute truth.